If you're new to sewing and you're trying to learn how to sew, this video is going to be mostly to people that's trying to learn how to sew. We're going to be using a standard Walmart 8-inch style square. This is what we'll be using as a template to cut these blocks out. This is the simplest to start with if you're new to sewing and you're trying to learn to sew, is doing the 8-inch block. If you're just starting out, the 8-inch blocks is much simpler. You just use it as a template and just trace around it with the cutting wheel. As long as you cut the squares perfect, the sewing will be easy. You won't have much mistakes in it. So what we've got today is we've got two 8-inch blocks. Both of the front is facing together. Both backs is on the outside. We've just butted them up. Now we're going to be running a vintage Free-Westinghouse machine from the 30s, 40s. So some people may be interested in this video if they're into old vintage machines and interested in seeing one actually do some quilt work. I'm halfway through this quilt. I've only got 3 more rows to go, so this is part of the 3 rows left. If you're running a machine that has different plates and different feet, it's a zigzag, you may want to switch your plates over to straight stitch and get a straight stitch foot if you've got a style of machine like that. So we're going to show you how to use this one. This one's got a different style, straight stitch foot. There's different straight stitch feet according to the brand. Some of them's more narrow. Singer will be more narrow than most. So this little toe here will be much smaller. This one's actually one of the larger style. So we're going to show you how to put these two 8-inch blocks together. This is just the basics on how to put them together. This machine I don't have to hold the thread tails. Some machines you got to hold those or you'll get a big knotted up mess. This machine is pretty basic, pretty simple. I'm going to be running a 10 stitches per inch because this fabric is a little stretchy and I want to weave it together a lot tighter. That way it'll be a lot more stronger. That's one thing why I sew my own quilts. When I need a quilt, I recycle the fabrics and stuff and sew them together tighter than ones you buy in a store. Ones you buy in a store will fall apart on you. You'll pay a big lot of money for a quilt and it'll be really thin and the stitching will be really loose. The machines won't be adjusted. It's sewed to quilt, so I make my own quilts. It's much easier to make your own and not worry about them falling apart. So I've got my 2 pieces together. I'm going to show you. I'm going to start off, just going to guide it along. This will give you a pretty straight, even seam line by just using the foot. You can put a seam guide on these machines. I usually don't use them. Now if I don't have an edge to go by, then I'll probably use a seam guide. But you can see how well it stitches. I generally like to use more stitches per inch on making something because most stuff that's made in China is usually over They're usually around 5 or more stitches, so they're a really wide stitch, and they usually want to come apart, especially if you pull on the fabric. If you get a t-shirt or something from Walmart, it's made in China, if you pull on it, you'll see the stitches in between, but you can see how tight this is. If you sew your own, you can make the quilt as thick as you want it for as cold the temperatures as you want. The seams will hold, whereas if you're buying a quilt, the seams will not hold. After a couple of washings, the fabric gets wet, it stretches and pulls. You'll rip out most of your seams in your quilts that you buy, and they'll just fall apart. So making your own will last a lot longer, because you can control the tension in the thread. You can control how many stitches per inch. Most commercially sewn stuff is sewn with a much larger stitch, usually about 5. Sometimes I've even seen them all the way down to like 4 stitches per inch. So you got these really long stitches, and you've got these big gaps in between them. It's just letting the fabric pull itself apart. So you can tell. Now if you sew the whole quilt using the same machine and using the same foot, the whole quilt will come together perfectly, as long as these blocks are cut perfect. Now if these blocks are not cut perfectly, or if you iron these blocks after you cut them, that is a no-no. If you cut a block and then you take an iron to it, it will stretch the block, and it will be a nightmare to put it together. So if you're gonna iron fabric, always iron your fabric before you cut it, never iron it after, because it will be a nightmare. You'll like to never get it put together, and there'll be seams that will go everywhere, and none of them will match. So that's the trick to sewing, just using an 8-inch block. Now a quilt will come together much faster using a larger block like this. I usually use 9 to 10 blocks across, 9 to 10 going down, and that'll usually give you almost a full-size quilt. But that's the basics on starting one. Another thing is, you can see on a vintage machine, or especially this one, it don't ball up the thread and make a big mess on the back side. Some of them will tangle up in a big knot, and you'll have a big knot right here that'll look really bad. This machine, it don't have that. It don't lock up. But that is how you put 8-inch blocks together. Once you get these rows sewed together to where it's a full row, then you can sew the rows together going across the quilt. And that's how you lay a quilt out if you're doing 8-inch blocks and you're doing the basics. It's a perfect way to learn how to sew if you're new to sewing and you're trying to learn how to sew. I do it because it's quick and simple. I don't have to worry with nothing. I can sew a bunch of 8-inch block quilts, throw them together, and use them. And I usually use leftover material, old jeans and stuff like that, recycle old fabric. But that's how you use a 8-inch block.